In the previous video, we've seen how in a king and pawn versus king endgame, the superior side, in our case white, can occupy the square in front of the pawn on the 6th rank and seize the opposition when the opposing king is on c8, and thereby exercise a turning maneuver to occupy the 7th rank and control the queening square and then advance the pawn into a queen. In this case, it's a little different. In this case, black is positioned on the 7th rank, not on c8, and so white cannot occupy the square in front of the pawn and seize the opposition. So it's a little different. However, what white can do is advance to the 6th rank, and that is a critical thing in a king and pawn versus king endgame. If the superior side can get in front of their pawn on one of the 3 squares immediately in front of the pawn, either on the square in front of the pawn or on the 2 sides, these are called the 3 critical squares, or what's known as the universe of the pawn. That's what Pandolfini calls it. And so if white can get in any of these 3 squares, then white is guaranteed a win if it doesn't screw up, if it plays correctly following that. So at this point, what white needs to do, if it's white's turn to act, is to move into d6. Okay, so that's very important. Not to move the pawn, of course, because white needs to occupy a critical square before it advances the pawn, and one of the critical squares is d6, which is the only square that white can occupy at this point. And so now white does not have the opposition just yet, but it doesn't really matter, because once white occupies this critical square, white is guaranteed a win. How? Well, let's see what happens. Black moves into c8. Now white seizes the opposition. Now black is forced out of the c file, and now white can occupy the d file and thereby control the queening square on c8. And now it's game over for black. So you can see how having control of one of the squares in front of the pawn when the pawn is still on the 5th rank is critical in winning the game. Now, we'll see in later videos that if the pawn is still on the 2nd, 3rd, or 4th rank, then white must control one of the 3 squares 2 ranks in front of the pawn, as opposed to just 1, before white can advance the pawn. Okay, why that is so is because the opposing king has more maneuvering room, and so the opposing king can force a draw even if white controls even if white is situated on one of the squares in front of the pawn. However, once white, and we'll see that in future videos, and I'm just giving you a preview of that, once white controls one of the squares in front of the pawn, even on the 2nd, 3rd, or 4th rank, white can force black to give ground, and white can forcefully control a rank in front of that, and so white can basically force a win. But white needs to remember to wait and not push the pawn until white controls 2 ranks in front of the pawn, if the pawn is still located on the 2nd, 3rd, or 4th rank. But we'll see all that in a future video. For now, what you need to remember is that if the pawn is on the 5th rank, as we see in this starting position, if the pawn is on the 5th rank, then what white needs to know is 1 square in front of the pawn, the 6th rank, that's the critical rank, and if white can get to one of those 3 squares, then white is guaranteed a win.